In May of 1954, deep in the remote mountains of northern Vietnam, the impossible was happening. French paratroopers, some of Europe's finest soldiers, were trapped in a valley surrounded by an enemy that wasn't supposed to exist. Heavy artillery thundered from jungle-covered hills, raining death on positions that military experts had declared impregnable. For 57 days, the world watched as a colonial empire crumbled under the weight of a revolutionary strategy so audacious that even seasoned generals refused to believe it could work. This wasn't just another colonial skirmish. This was the moment when everything changed. When a former history teacher named Võ Nguyên Giáp rewrote the rules of modern warfare and brought the mighty French Empire to its knees, what unfolded at Điện Biên Phủ would send shockwaves through the halls of power from Paris to Washington, marking the beginning of the end for European colonialism in Southeast Asia. But to understand how this remote valley became the graveyard of French ambitions, we need to journey back to the moment when France made the most catastrophic military decision of the 20th century. A decision that would trap 16,000 of their best soldiers in what would become known as hell on earth. The year was 1953, and France was bleeding. For 7 years, they had been fighting a guerrilla war against the Việt Minh that was draining their treasury and breaking their will. Every month brought fresh casualty reports from the jungles of Indochina. Every battle seemed to favor an enemy that struck like lightning and vanished into the mountains. The French public was growing tired of a war that seemed to have no end, no clear victory in sight. Into this desperate situation stepped General Henri Navarre, a cold, calculating officer tasked with finding an honorable way out of the quagmire. What he found when he arrived in Saigon shocked him to his core. There was no plan, no strategy, just a day-to-day reactive approach that had left French forces scattered and demoralized across a hostile landscape. His predecessors had essentially been marking time, waiting for someone else to solve an unsolvable problem. Navarre was ordered to create military conditions that would force the Viet Minh to negotiate. But instead of playing it safe, instead of consolidating French positions and preparing for withdrawal, he decided to roll the dice on one massive gamble. He would create a fortress so strong, so well positioned, that the Viet Minh would have no choice but to attack it. And when they did, French firepower would destroy them once and for all. The location he chose seemed perfect. Dien Biên Phủ, a valley in the remote northwest corner of Vietnam, 20 kilometers long and 6 kilometers wide, surrounded by forested hills. It sat astride the main supply route into neighboring Laos, where the Viet Minh were supporting communist forces. If the French could hold this valley, they could cut off enemy supplies and force Giap's army into the kind of pitched battle where French artillery and air power would prove decisive. On November 20th, 1953, the sky above Điện Biên Phủ filled with parachutes. Operation Castor had begun. Wave after wave of French paratroopers dropped into the valley, the largest airborne operation since World War II. Within 3 days, 9,000 troops had landed, along with artillery, supplies, and even a bulldozer to improve the airstrip. The operation was flawless, executed with precision that reminded the world why French paratroopers were considered among the finest soldiers on earth. The French command was euphoric. They had seized the valley without firing a shot. Local Thai tribesmen had fled into the hills, leaving behind rice stores and an intact Japanese-built airstrip. Within weeks, engineers had transformed the valley into a fortress. Strong points ringed the perimeter, each one named after the mistresses of the French commander, Colonel Christian de Castries. Gabrielle controlled the northern approaches. Beatrice guarded the northeast. Anne-Marie, Huguette, Françoise, Claudine, Eliane, Dominique, and Isabelle formed an interlocking web of bunkers, trenches, and artillery positions. From the air, it looked impregnable. Barbed wire stretched in endless coils. Machine gun nests commanded every approach. Artillery pieces were positioned to deliver devastating fire on any attacking force. The French had created what they believed was an unbreakable trap. All they had to do was wait for Giap to take the bait. But 300 kilometers away, in a cave hidden deep in the Viet Bac Mountains, General Võ Nguyên Giáp was studying maps and making calculations that would change the course of history. The man the French dismissed as an amateur, a former schoolteacher playing at being a general, was about to demonstrate an understanding of warfare that would humble the professional soldiers of Europe. Giap saw what the French could not. Yes, Dien Bien Phu controlled the road to Laos. Yes, it would force the Viet Minh to fight a conventional battle. But the French had also done something extraordinarily foolish. They had placed their entire elite force in a valley completely surrounded by high ground, supplied only by air, hundreds of kilometers from any friendly forces. The conventional military wisdom said this was impossible to exploit. The hills around Dien Bien Phu were too steep, too densely forested, too far from any roads to position heavy artillery. The French had calculated that the Viet Minh could bring at most a few light mortars and machine guns to bear on their positions. Against the concentrated firepower of French artillery and the constant threat of airstrikes, such weapons would be useless. Giap thought differently. Where the French saw impossible terrain, he saw opportunity. Where they saw logistical nightmares, he saw the chance to apply lessons learned from years of fighting a people's war. The Viet Minh had moved armies through jungles before. They had supplied forces across impossible distances, using nothing but bicycles and human labor. If it could be done anywhere, it could be done here. But this would require more than just moving troops. To break the French fortress, Giap would need heavy artillery. Lots of it. The kind of big guns that could smash concrete bunkers and silence French batteries. The kind of weapons that supposedly couldn't be moved through jungle terrain without roads, without mechanized transport, without the infrastructure of modern warfare. In December 1953, as French engineers continued to strengthen their positions in the valley below, something unprecedented began happening in the mountains around Dien Bien Phu. Thousands of Vietnamese peasants, workers and soldiers started the most remarkable logistical operation in military history. They were going to move a modern army, complete with heavy artillery, across 300 kilometers of jungle and mountains, using nothing but their bare hands and unbreakable will. The weapons came from an unexpected source. China, fresh from its victory in the Korean War, had stockpiles of captured American artillery and Soviet-supplied heavy guns. Howitzers, mortars, anti-aircraft weapons, millions of rounds of ammunition, all of it began moving south toward the Vietnamese border. But getting the weapons to China was only the beginning of the challenge. From the Chinese border, the guns had to travel another 200 kilometers through territory that didn't even have proper roads. The existing trails were suitable for pack animals at best, certainly not for moving artillery pieces that weighed several tons each. So the Vietnamese built new roads, carving paths through mountains and jungles in a feat of engineering that defied belief. But the most incredible part was still to come. Once the artillery reached the mountains around Dien Bien Phu, it had to be positioned on the forward slopes of the hills overlooking the French positions. This meant hauling multi-ton howitzers up steep jungle slopes by hand, then digging them into camouflaged positions where they would be invisible to French reconnaissance. Traditional military doctrine said this was impossible. Artillery was supposed to be positioned on reverse slopes, hidden from enemy observation. Placing guns on forward slopes exposed them to counter-battery fire and air attack. But Giap understood something the French textbooks didn't teach. In jungle terrain, properly camouflaged positions could be virtually invisible even at close range, and by placing his guns on forward slopes, he could achieve direct fire on French positions while making it nearly impossible for French artillery to locate and destroy his weapons. As 1954 dawned, the trap was being set. But it wasn't the trap the French thought they had built. Night after night, through the monsoon rains of early 1954, an army materialized in the darkness around Dien Bien Phu. Not the ragged collection of guerrilla fighters the French expected, but a disciplined force of 60,000 troops supported by artillery that shouldn't have existed. Chinese advisors moved like shadows among Viet Minh units, veterans of Korea who understood exactly how to break a fortified position. Soviet-trained specialists positioned anti-aircraft guns with mathematical precision, creating overlapping fields of fire that would turn the valley into a death trap for French aircraft. The scale of the operation defied comprehension. 261,000 civilians had volunteered for the logistics effort, a human chain stretching from China to the mountains of northwest Vietnam. They carried rice in bamboo tubes, ammunition in wicker baskets, medical supplies on their backs, Bicycles were modified with bamboo extensions, allowing a single porter to carry 500 pounds of supplies along jungle trails. When roads were too damaged for vehicles, they carried truck engines piece by piece through the mountains and reassembled them on the other side. But the crown jewel of this impossible achievement was the artillery. 24 American-made 105mm howitzers, captured by Chinese forces in Korea, now pointed down at French positions from heights the defenders had assumed were safe. Heavier weapons followed. 120mm mortars that could drop shells directly into French bunkers, recoilless rifles that could punch through concrete, anti-aircraft guns that would soon turn the lifeline of French air supply into a shooting gallery. The positioning of these weapons was a masterpiece of military engineering. Each gun was hand-carried up slopes so steep that crews had to cut steps into the mountainsides. Camouflage was absolute. Artillery pieces disappeared into hand-dug caves carved from solid rock, with only their muzzles protruding through carefully constructed firing ports. From the air, even at low altitude, the positions were completely invisible. Meanwhile, in the valley below, the French remained supremely confident. Their intelligence reports spoke of a few thousand Viet Minh irregulars in the surrounding hills, armed with obsolete weapons and led by commanders with no understanding of modern warfare. Colonel Piroth, the French artillery commander, boasted that his guns would destroy any enemy force foolish enough to attack. He had calculated the fields of fire with mathematical precision. Every approach to the valley was covered by interlocking artillery zones. The moment Giap's forces revealed themselves, French firepower would annihilate them. The fortress itself had grown into something that resembled a small city. Underground bunkers connected by trenches and communication tunnels. Artillery positions protected by tons of concrete and steel. Anti-aircraft guns positioned to defend the critical airstrip. Supply dumps filled with enough ammunition and food to withstand a siege of months. The French had even built a field hospital, a brothel, and a small cinema to keep morale high during what they expected to be a brief, decisive engagement. But Giap was playing a different game entirely. While the French prepared for a conventional battle, he was orchestrating something that would later be studied in military academies around the world. The Viet Minh commander understood that this wasn't just about tactics or firepower. This was about will, about patience, about turning the French strengths into weaknesses. His original plan had called for a swift assault, a fast attack, fast victory that would overrun the French positions before they could organize an effective defense. Chinese advisors had studied the terrain and calculated the odds. A coordinated artillery barrage, followed by human wave attacks, could potentially breach the French perimeter within days. But as January 1954 drew to a close, Giap made the most difficult decision of his military career. Standing in his command bunker, studying intelligence reports and casualty estimates, the Vietnamese general realized that conventional wisdom was wrong. A direct assault would succeed, but at a cost that could cripple his forces even in victory. The French were expecting exactly this kind of attack. Their defenses were designed to channel attacking forces into killing zones where superior firepower would exact a terrible toll. On January 26, 1954, Giap called off the assault. Orders went out to artillery crews who had spent weeks positioning their guns for maximum effect. Troops who had rehearsed their attacks until they could execute them in their sleep were told to stand down. The heavy weapons that had been moved through impossible terrain at unimaginable cost were withdrawn from their forward positions. The decision sent shockwaves through his own command structure. Junior officers questioned the sanity of abandoning an attack that seemed certain to succeed. Political commissars worried about the impact on morale. Chinese advisors argued that delay would only give the French time to strengthen their positions and potentially discover the true scale of Viet Minh preparations. But Giap had seen something others missed. Time was not on the French side. Every day they remained trapped in the valley, their situation grew more precarious. Their supplies came entirely by air, flown in by transport aircraft that were increasingly vulnerable to the anti-aircraft weapons now ringing the valley. Weather was becoming a factor, with monsoon clouds making aerial resupply unreliable. Most importantly, the political situation in France was deteriorating as casualties mounted and public support for the war evaporated. Instead of a swift knockout blow, Giap chose the patient path of strangulation. Steady attack, steady advance became the new doctrine. Rather than storming French positions, the Viet Minh would dig toward them, using the same trench warfare tactics that had bled the great powers white in the First World War. Every night, Vietnamese sappers would move a few meters closer to French lines, their approach covered by carefully coordinated artillery fire that the defenders could not effectively answer. The psychological impact of this decision was as important as the tactical one. French morale, initially high, began to crack under the strain of endless bombardment and the knowledge that an invisible enemy was slowly tightening the noose. Pilots flying supply missions reported increasing anti-aircraft fire, with several aircraft shot down and their crews captured or killed. The airstrip itself came under regular artillery fire, making landings increasingly dangerous. Inside the fortress, conditions deteriorated rapidly. The French had not prepared for a prolonged siege. Medical facilities, designed for a brief engagement, were overwhelmed by casualties from constant shelling. Food supplies, calculated for a few weeks of operations, began running low as aerial resupply became more difficult and dangerous. The monsoon rains turned trenches into rivers of mud, breeding disease and sapping the strength of defenders who rarely saw sunlight. But it was the artillery duel that truly revealed the extent of French miscalculation. When Viet Minh guns finally opened fire on March 13th, 1954, the bombardment was unlike anything the defenders had experienced. Shells fell with mathematical precision, guided by observers who had spent weeks mapping every French position. The supposedly impregnable bunkers cracked under the impact of heavy mortars. Artillery pieces that had been positioned to dominate the valley were systematically destroyed by counter-battery fire that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Colonel Piroth, the man who had guaranteed French artillery superiority, watched his carefully positioned guns destroyed one by one. Unable to locate the enemy weapons that were tearing his defenses apart, unable to protect the men under his command, he made the ultimate admission of failure. On the night of March 15th, he pulled the pin from a hand grenade and held it against his chest, dying instantly in what he saw as the only honorable response to his catastrophic misjudgment. The destruction of French artillery marked the beginning of the end. But it was only the beginning. Giap's master plan was just starting to unfold, and the worst was yet to come for the trapped garrison. With Piroth's death echoing through the shattered bunkers, the true scope of Giap's genius began to reveal itself. The Vietnamese commander had not simply positioned artillery in impossible locations. He had created an entire underground city in the mountains surrounding Dien Biên Phủ, a network of tunnels, supply depots, and hidden positions that defied everything Western military doctrine taught about logistics and camouflage. From his command post carved into solid rock, Giap orchestrated a symphony of destruction that played out with methodical precision. Every morning brought fresh intelligence from observers hidden in the jungle canopy, men who had been watching French positions for months, mapping every bunker, every trench, every weak point in the defensive perimeter. The bombardment that followed was not random violence, but surgical strikes designed to maximize psychological impact while conserving precious ammunition. The French pilots who still dared to fly supply missions into the valley reported a landscape transformed into something from a nightmare. What had once been neat military positions now resembled the cratered moonscape of the Western Front. Smoke rose constantly from burning fuel dumps and ammunition stores. The airstrip itself, lifeline of the garrison, was pockmarked with shell holes that made landing increasingly treacherous. But it was beneath the surface that Giap's most devastating innovation was taking shape. Vietnamese sappers, many of them former coal miners from the industrial regions of North Vietnam, began digging a network of approach trenches that would have impressed the engineers of Verdun. Working only at night, moving forward mere meters at a time, they carved zigzag patterns through the valley floor that brought them closer to French positions with each passing hour. The sound of their digging became a constant torment for the defenders. French sentries strained their ears in the darkness, trying to pinpoint the source of the scraping and hammering that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Patrols sent out to locate the diggers often vanished without a trace, their fate unknown until Vietnamese loudspeakers began broadcasting the names of captured soldiers. Psychological warfare designed to shatter already fragile morale. Inside the fortress, the reality of their situation was becoming impossible to ignore. The wounded filled every available space in the underground hospital, their screams echoing through tunnels that had become tombs for the living. Medical supplies, never adequate for a prolonged siege, dwindled to nothing. Surgeons performed amputations without anesthesia, while artillery shells exploded overhead, the constant barrage making rest impossible and driving even veteran soldiers to the edge of madness. Food became an obsession that consumed every waking moment. The carefully calculated rations designed for a brief operation stretched to starvation levels as aerial resupply grew more sporadic and dangerous. Pilots reported that the valley had become a shooting gallery, with anti-aircraft fire so intense that many supply drops missed their targets entirely, precious cargo falling into Vietnamese hands instead of reaching the starving garrison. The French command in Hanoi watched their elite force disintegrate through increasingly desperate radio transmissions. Colonel de Castries, the dashing cavalryman who had boasted of breaking Giap's army, now sent coded messages that spoke of collapsing morale and impossible conditions. His voice, once confident and commanding, took on the hollow tone of a man watching his world collapse around him. But Giap was far from finished. The destruction of French artillery had been merely the opening movement of a larger composition. As March wore on, the true scale of Viet Minh preparations became apparent. The trenches that had begun as simple approach routes evolved into a complex network that eventually stretched for kilometers, an underground highway system that allowed Vietnamese troops to move unseen throughout the battlefield. From these tunnels emerged assault teams, armed with weapons that shouldn't have existed in this remote corner of the world. Flamethrowers cleared French bunkers with terrifying efficiency. Satchel charges planted by sappers who moved like ghosts through the darkness destroyed defensive positions that had taken weeks to construct. Most devastating of all were the recoilless rifles, weapons captured from American forces in Korea that could punch through concrete and steel with surgical precision. The siege had become a laboratory for revolutionary warfare, with Giap experimenting with tactics that combined ancient principles of patient encirclement with modern weapons and communications. Chinese advisors moved through Viet Minh positions, their experience in Korea invaluable as they directed artillery strikes and coordinated infantry assaults. Soviet equipment, from radio sets to medical supplies, flowed through the jungle supply lines that kept this impossible army functioning in terrain that should have made modern warfare impossible. French counterattacks, when they came, were met with defensive fire that seemed to anticipate every move. Vietnamese machine gunners, positioned in camouflaged bunkers that were invisible until they opened fire, cut down assault teams before they could reach their objectives. Mortar crews, operating from positions that changed nightly, dropped shells with mathematical precision on French assembly areas. The defenders found themselves fighting an enemy that was everywhere and nowhere, visible only in the muzzle flashes that lit up the darkness before vanishing again into the jungle night. The psychological warfare was as devastating as the physical bombardment. Vietnamese loudspeakers, broadcasting in French, German, and Arabic, targeted the multinational composition of the garrison with propaganda tailored to each group. They spoke to French soldiers of their families back home, wondering why they were dying in a jungle on the other side of the world for a cause their own government was abandoning. They reminded foreign legionnaires that they were fighting for an empire that would never accept them as true citizens. They offered safe passage to colonial troops who had been forced into uniform by French conscription. Desertion, once unthinkable among elite paratroopers, began to thin the ranks as men slipped away into the jungle darkness, preferring the uncertainty of Vietnamese captivity to the certainty of death in the crumbling bunkers. Those who remained grew hollow-eyed and desperate, their once pristine uniforms now rags stained with mud and blood, their equipment jury-rigged from salvaged parts as resupply became increasingly impossible. The monsoon rains that began in April transformed the battlefield into a hellscape of mud and standing water. Trenches became rivers that threatened to drown wounded soldiers too weak to move. Equipment rusted and malfunctioned in the constant dampness. Disease spread through the crowded bunkers like wildfire, dysentery and malaria claiming as many victims as Vietnamese bullets. But it was the systematic destruction of French strongpoints that truly demonstrated Giap's mastery of siege warfare. Each defensive position was isolated and reduced, using tactics perfected over months of careful preparation. Beatrice fell first, overwhelmed by a coordinated assault that began with devastating artillery fire and ended with Vietnamese infantry swarming through breached defenses. Gabrielle followed days later, her defenders cut off from reinforcement and gradually worn down by constant bombardment and sniper fire. The pattern was always the same. First came the artillery, shells falling with mechanical precision on targets that had been surveyed and mapped during months of patient observation. Then came the sappers, moving through approach trenches that brought them within throwing distance of French positions. Finally came the assault troops, men who had rehearsed their attacks until they could execute them in complete darkness, overwhelming defenders who were already broken by weeks of constant stress and inadequate supplies. Each victory brought the Viet Minh closer to the heart of the French position, tightening the noose around the remaining strongpoints with methodical patience. The defenders watched their perimeter shrink night by night, their fields of fire reduced, their ability to support each other degraded by the loss of each position. What had begun as a fortress had become a trap, with the hunters now the hunted. French air support, once considered a decisive advantage, proved increasingly ineffective against an enemy that had mastered the art of camouflage and concealment. Bombing runs missed their targets, the pilots unable to distinguish between real positions and the dummy installations that Vietnamese engineers had constructed with devious ingenuity. Fighter bombers that ventured too low were met with anti-aircraft fire that had transformed the valley into a no-fly zone for all but the most desperate supply missions. The final phase of the siege was approaching, and with it would come horrors that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. And so, on May 7th, 1954, after 57 days of hell, the impossible fortress of Dien Bien Phu finally fell. The white flag that rose over the shattered bunkers marked more than just the end of a battle. It was the death knell of European empire in Southeast Asia, the moment when a former history teacher proved that determination and revolutionary thinking could topple the mightiest military machines. Of the 16,000 French soldiers who had parachuted into that valley with such confidence, fewer than 3,000 would ever see home again. The rest lay buried in the mud of the monsoon, or faced the nightmare march to prison camps, where death would claim most of those who had survived the siege. It was a catastrophe so complete, so shocking, that it brought down the government in Paris and forced France to abandon its dreams of empire in Indochina. But Giap's victory at Dien Bien Phu was more than just a military triumph. It was proof that the age of colonial dominance was ending, that technology and firepower meant nothing without the will to use them wisely. The lessons learned in that remote valley would echo through the halls of the Pentagon, where American planners were already contemplating their own intervention in Vietnam. They would learn, as the French had learned too late, that some wars cannot be won by the side that refuses to understand what they are truly fighting for.